Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Speaking of Resilience podcast. I'm your host, Kate Madigan with the Michigan Climate Action Network. This podcast is also brought to you by the Groundwork Center. In this episode, we interview Margrethe Kearney, Senior Attorney at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, who we are working with to prevent Enbridge from getting approval to build an oil tunnel under the Great Lakes. In this interview, we talk about the evidence recently filed in our case by our 4 expert witnesses. They found that building an oil tunnel would add 27 million metric tons of climate emissions every year. This is the equivalent to adding 6 million cars to the road. Our experts found this would result in billions of dollars of climate impacts. And they found much more that we'll get into in this interview. So join us for a conversation with the lawyer who's leading the fight that for the first time is getting a Michigan agency to consider climate change in a decision. Here's our interview with Margrethe Kearney. So welcome to the podcast, Margrethe. It is so great to talk to you today about this really important and groundbreaking work to prevent Enbridge's proposed oil tunnel.
Thanks, Kate. I'm very excited to be here.
So to get us started, will you tell us about the Environmental Law and Policy Center and what your role is there?
Sure. So the Environmental Law and Policy Center is a Midwest-based environmental advocacy group. So what sets us apart from a lot of other environmental groups that you hear of is we're regional in scope. We work in the Midwest. People who work at ELPC are by and large people who live in the Midwest. We play in the Midwest. We grew up in the Midwest. We understand the Midwest. So we know that solutions that might work in other parts of the country or other parts of the world might need to be tweaked to work in the Midwest. And we focus on protecting our air and our water and our unique places that we have in this Great Lakes region. I am our Michigan office, which is very exciting. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and this is where our office is located now. And I'm a senior attorney, and I get to work with outstanding organizations like the Michigan Climate Action Network to represent them in legal proceedings in Michigan.
And I just want to point out for our listeners that you went to Harvard Law School. And so if you're going to go up against a company like Enbridge, who has all the money that the lawyers that money can buy, we are fortunate to be able to lawyer up with someone of your caliber and the whole ELPC team. So now that I've sufficiently embarrassed you, MyCan and ELPC are formal interveners in the Michigan Public Service Commission's decision whether to authorize Enbridge's proposed oil tunnel under the Great Lakes. So to set up this conversation, I want everyone to understand that. So the oil tunnel that's proposed would replace the Line 5 oil pipeline in the Straits that the governor has ordered to be shut down. On September 14th, which is just the time that this airs, it'll just be a couple of weeks ago, our expert witnesses filed their testimony about the climate impacts of the Line 5 tunnel. These experts are really leaders in their fields nationally, and they found really compelling evidence. So that's what we're going to talk about. I want to talk about what they found. So first, to give us an overview, though, what was the evidence that we wanted to get in the record and, how this works at the MPSC's review of the tunnel? Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, so the evidence that we wanted to get into the record was really evidence about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. In these Public Service Commission cases, there are often a number of different intervening parties, and they address, different issues that they see with the application. The issue that we wanted to address was very specifically, what are the climate impacts? What kind of greenhouse gas emissions are we going to see as a result of building this tunnel under the Straits?
And so then let's talk about this evidence, starting with expert Peter Erickson. He calculated the climate emissions that building an oil tunnel would add. Will you tell us about what he found?
I will, but can I back you up just one second? Because I want to underscore the magnitude of that's what we wanted to get into this record. That was not something that was accepted or agreed to, right, by Enbridge. They fiercely opposed this coming into the record. So just sort of highlighting for folks that understanding of like what a big deal it was that we were able to really even, bring this into the record.
Well, yeah. And let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, so we wanted to include climate change, and the administrative law judge initially ruled against us and sided with Enbridge and said, no, we're not going to include evidence of climate change when we're deciding on this tunnel.
Right. And it was, Enbridge in their briefs, they kept referring to climate change as like an agenda, a political issue, right? Something which is really troubling to hear when you're somebody who cares very much about the climate crisis. And I think that it also, the administrative law judge's opinion in keeping climate out, there was very much this sense of like, climate's too big a thing, right? It's too hard for us to really look at in these individual cases. And I think that concerned me. That made me worried, right? Now is exactly when we need to start including climate in all of our decision making. And so it was really reaffirming, and it gave me a lot of hope to see that the commission disagreed with Enbridge and disagreed with the administrative law judge and was like, no, greenhouse gases are pollutants. They impact natural resources. Like, this is something we really do need to consider here. So.
Yeah, so we appealed the judge's decision, and then the commissioners ultimately ruled in our favor and said we were going to consider evidence about the climate impacts of this tunnel as part of our decision-making process.
Right.
And so that's what opened up this opportunity to present the testimony that we're talking about today, this expert testimony. And I also want to point out that this is the first time that a Michigan agency is considering climate evidence in a decision under the Michigan Environmental Protection Act. And so can you talk a little bit about the significance of that?
I mean, in my mind, I think what it means is that we're no longer talking about climate as a, political issue. We're no longer taking sides and denying that it's happened. They're happening. There's enough evidence out there. It is accepted that this is an issue. It's happening, and we need to address it. So our environmental laws in Michigan, this Michigan Environmental Protection Act, which is intended to protect our natural resources. So it creates this requirement that all of our government decision makers look at impacts to natural resources. It's written in such a way that it's fairly broad. And so it changes as our understanding of science changes and our understanding of how different pollutants impact the environment changes. And we are now changing with it, right? We are now including in that group of things that we consider greenhouse gas emissions and climate. And so I think, to me, it's this affirmation that, we're going to take this problem seriously, and we're going to really incorporate it into all of our decision making. Up until now, that really it just hasn't been done. Climate has not been something that any agency or judge or anyone looks at when making a decision about a project that impacts natural resources in Michigan.
And do you think with this ruling that it'll change how other agencies are looking at climate change?
I think so. I think that it will certainly have an impact on other agencies and the breadth of their review.
So we worked, it was a long drawn out battle to get to this point, to be allowed to present the evidence. And now here we are, we have this pretty incredible evidence, I think, that was entered into the record. So starting with Peter Erickson, calculating the climate emissions of building the oil tunnel, which is a number that we've wanted to have for years. So what did he find?
So he found kind of the big picture that Pete Erickson came away with is that building the tunnel will result in 27 million more metric tons of carbon equivalent being emitted than if Enbridge shut down the tunnel or shut down the pipelines and didn't build the tunnel. right? So he was comparing what kind of emissions will we see if the existing pipelines are shut down and there's a tunnel built versus the existing pipeline is shut down and the tunnel's not built. So one of the key components there is the existing pipeline needs to be shut down, right? That's a fundamental assumption in any of the alternatives that are being looked at.
So this is kind of a little bit complicated, and that's why it took an expert to do this analysis. And I want to point out that Peter Erickson has done this before. He's done these calculations for other pipelines. He's well respected in being able to calculate what the greenhouse gas emissions of building an oil tunnel would be. And so he looked at the greenhouse gas emissions of the existing pipeline. And Peter Erickson looked at the oil that currently flows through Line 5. If Line 5 is shut down and no tunnel is built, some of that oil will still get to market. It will have to go through different transport. And in some cases, it will have to go through rail, which will increase the cost. And he looked at all of the oil fields, and for some of them, increasing the cost $6 a barrel will make it not profitable to develop those oil fields. And so his analysis found that about 290,000 barrels of oil currently in the ground would not be developed because it would no longer be profitable. And that's per day, 290,000 barrels of oil per day, which is equivalent to 27 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. So one way that we could talk about this is to break it down to say, well, Kate, you've read this testimony. So, if the oil pipeline, if the tunnel isn't built, how will that oil get to market? It'll get there through rail, right? And rail is more expensive. And if it's more expensive, then is all of that oil going to be developed? No, right? So less oil is going to be taken out of the ground and shipped. The supply of oil is going to be lower, right? And the price, because the supply is lower, the price of oil is going to be a little bit higher globally, right? We're not talking locally in Michigan here and there, but globally. The price of oil is going to be a little bit higher. And not as much oil is going to be consumed in end use, not as much oil is going to be extracted. So we will have less oil that ultimately is used globally.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought up the cost, because he specifically gets into that in his testimony, that while on a macro level, this increase in cost will change what oil and what oil fields are developed. It'll change the big picture. We're not going to feel this at the pump. This is going to be equivalent to about a penny per gallon. So this isn't going to really harm Michiganders by shutting down Line 5 and not building a tunnel.
Yeah, it's felt like, I think that these small changes, and that's the way to think about some of these smaller changes, is it might not impact you in this grave and profound way that you notice every day, but it changes little things, right? And it might change choices that developers make or big users of petroleum products make. So it's not that it's this tiny little thing that nobody responds to and that isn't going to impact how much oil we use. No, it will impact it. It's just that no single one of us is going to feel it acutely, which is kind of a win-win, right?
Yeah.
If this project doesn't go forward, the sky will not fall, but there will be fewer greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, and a lot fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So I took the number 27 million metric tons a year, and I ran it through the EPA's greenhouse gas equivalencies calculator. That's equivalent to 6.8 coal-fired power plants, or 6 million cars on the road. So by not approving this oil tunnel, we will be reducing the greenhouse gas equivalent of 6.8 new power plants. That's very significant, especially at this point in the climate crisis.
Yeah, and it's really helpful when you put it in those terms. That's part of the reason why it was really important that we bring in Peter Howard, who was our second expert, who is, incredibly well known for all of his work on the social cost of greenhouse gases, because you can talk about how many metric tons, and a lot of people have a hard time understanding what that means, right? Like, what's the value of that? What's the impact of that? And so Peter Howard talks about the social cost of greenhouse gases, which is this really well-established method of putting a dollar value, right, on what the impacts of carbon emissions are, greenhouse gas emissions are. It doesn't include everything. And he talks about that in his testimony too. There are these things that are omitted, right? It's conservative. It undercounts what the dollar impacts are, but it's one way of putting something in front of decision makers, in front of the public, in a way that is a little more understandable than talking about like tons of carbon equivalents that are emitted.
Yes. And he found in his testimony that building this tunnel would, and the greenhouse gas emissions that we just talked about, would result in an estimated $41 billion or more in climate costs because of the climate impacts. Included in his testimony, up to $160 billion.
Right, which is, it's, to me, one of the things that does is it really turns on its head. You hear folks say, well, yeah, the climate crisis is terrible, but it would be so expensive to do all these things to stop it. Well, think about how expensive it is to let it happen, right? We never talk about how costly it is to allow these carbon emissions into our air and to have them impact climate change in these very measurable and very expensive ways. So it's kind of like, we can't afford not to do something here. It's too expensive to try to fix the problem. It's way too expensive to not fix the problem. Billions of dollars. It's a lot.
Yeah. And this is, to kind of illustrate this even more for our listeners, this is like how much it costs to repair the damage from hurricanes. And as you said, this is a really conservative model because it doesn't include wildfires currently. It doesn't include inland flooding. So like the flooding we're seeing in Detroit, that's not even included in here. So we know the cost is a lot higher than this. But even these tens of hundreds of billions of dollars is enormous. And then another expert, so we had 4 expert witnesses. Another expert witness we had that provided testimony was Dr. Jonathan Overpeck, who is the dean of the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, and also is a climate scientist who has been a lead author on IPCC reports. So will you talk about some of the highlights of his testimony and why his testimony was so important to be included?
Yeah, so it was really important to have, for one thing, just to have in the record for the commission this very clear, very persuasive evidence. Greenhouse gas emissions are impacting climate change, and here are the types of things that will happen if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? Like, we just needed that very fundamental principle to be part of this case and explained to the commission. But what Dr. Overpeck did, and I think it draws on what you were just talking about, one of the things that he did is he talked about how climate is impacting Michigan. So when we think about climate change, I think a lot of times the coasts get a lot of attention, right? So wildfires out west, and then maybe, hurricanes to the east, or, you'll talk about the polar ice caps, and a lot of these really visceral and heartbreaking things that we see as impacts of climate change. They're happening in Michigan. Right now, they're happening in Michigan. We're seeing them, we're experiencing them. And Dr. Overpeck talked about what will happen and what those impacts will look like if we don't stop emitting greenhouse gases, right? If we don't start making decisions that prevent more greenhouse gas emissions. And I thought that was really compelling, because in Michigan, I think a lot of times we think, well, it's happening somewhere else. It's not happening to us, but it is happening to us every day.
Yes. Yeah. His testimony, I tried to summarize a lot of his testimony, and his was so full of compelling information that it was hard to even, write up some bullet points for myself. And I think the other thing that his testimony includes is really the evidence that it is the burning of fossil fuels that is the primary source of the increase in greenhouse gases that has gotten us to this point. So I think that's really important to point out.
Yeah, he definitely, establishes that link. And there's so many bodies of work that he can point to for that. It's like the amount of evidence is almost overwhelming. And so having somebody with his experience and his credentials to be able to just kind of lay it out and synthesize all that information, I think is really useful. I'll say, it's some of the that really struck me when in his testimony was the lack of predictability of severe weather, which I feel like I've been feeling definitely in Michigan recently. And that, we'll have sort of warmer periods, our temperatures are going to go up, and our rainfall already is, and would be more so, like very intense. And that's not good, right? Like instead of having sort of precipitation that is over a more significant period of time and sort of can keep the soil moist predictably, to have these sudden onslaughts of intense rain events is really challenging for individuals, for agriculture, and for our natural resources, for trees and plants and water bodies. And I saw a lot of things like that where I'm like, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. I see that. And it's troubling.
Mm-hmm. And he also talked about how taking significant action, he also summarized the scientific findings that taking significant action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions now would still result in very modest greenhouse gas emission, very modest rise in temperature of about 0.5 to 1 degree. And our region would experience more moderate climate impacts. So there's still time for us to avoid these worst consequences of climate change.
Right.
And then our fourth expert, Dr. Elizabeth Stanton, looked at the alternatives. Will you talk about the significance and what her findings are?
Sure. So Dr. Stanton looked at whether or not it was feasible to consider an alternative where Enbridge does not build the tunnel and the line doesn't operate, right? Because as we've already established, like what the impacts are on natural resources, right? Those first three experts really laid out. But is there a feasible alternative? Is there something else they could do? And she specifically looked at the, alternative of not building the tunnel, not operating the pipeline. And there's been a lot of questions raised about how that would impact specifically propane in the Upper Peninsula. There's also been a lot of work done in Michigan on how to address that. And so she had a lot of information and evidence to look at where she could come to the conclusion and say, listen, things will have to be done, changes will have to be made, programs developed, but people can be switched from propane to other sources of home heating. And so we're not going to be in a position where if the tunnel isn't built and the line shuts down, all of a sudden, nobody in the Upper Peninsula or Northern Michigan can heat their homes. Like, that's not the outcome. And so that was really encouraging because, she's clearly saying, yeah, it would be absolutely feasible to not build this tunnel.
Yes. I also found that's so compelling. Like, an expert economist has looked at this and is confirming it's feasible to not build a tunnel. I found it really interesting when I read how she was saying it's a best practice when you're looking at a project that you look at the no action alternative in this case, which is not building a tunnel and shutting down Line 5. And that Enbridge artificially limited its analysis of alternatives because they only looked at the options, the alternatives that would continue the transporting of hydrocarbons, of oil and gas across the straits. So even when you look at the alternatives analysis that was done years ago under the Snyder administration, there was an independent analysis. I remember reading it. They looked at building a tunnel. They looked at replacing Line 5 with another pipeline. They looked at not replacing it. And in that report, they said, yeah, that's a feasible alternative. But Enbridge never really looked at that alternative, even though that's the best way that you're going to protect the Great Lakes from an oil spill. And it's the only way that you're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think she used the phrase false choice. That really just grabbed me, that like Enbridge is setting up this false choice for the commission to make by not presenting that as an alternative.
Yeah. And I want to go back to Peter Ericksons' testimony also, because one key point that we haven't mentioned yet is that he found that constructing an oil tunnel would be inconsistent with state and international climate goals. And he points out that, Governor Whitmer pledged to make Michigan carbon neutral and to meet the Paris Agreement goals, which would include limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to do this, carbon emissions must be reduced to 0 by 2050 and cut in half by 2030. And so building an oil tunnel, he points out, is inconsistent with these goals.
Yep. Yeah, it's absolutely right. And that's part of why, setting these goals, I think, is another way that we're starting to, routinely incorporate looking at climate and at carbon emissions into our decision making. Like, because we have these goals, when we have projects we consider, when government's making decisions, they can look at it and say, wait, is this consistent with our goals? Well, here's one that's clearly not.
Yeah. So what is next in this process? When do we expect to have a final decision from the MPSC?
So the next step is that we will get rebuttal testimony from Enbridge and potentially other interveners or staff. And we also have the opportunity to submit our own rebuttal testimony. That all comes in December. And then there's cross-examination of all the witnesses in January. So this is like, we call it a quasi-judicial proceeding sometimes. It's like a trial, but it's not quite as formal. And a lot of it goes in written testimony instead of live. But anyone who submits testimony can be cross-examined. And so that will happen. And then the parties will brief the issue and put it to the administrative law judge. So there are a lot more steps in this process. There's no deadline or requirement for the commission to make a decision. And I don't anticipate that they could make a decision in a case this complex in anything under another year.
Thank you for that. And then also, Enbridge also needs a permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to build this tunnel. That's another place where another, requirement. So where are we at with that process?
So that process is in its infancy because the Army Corps has recognized that they, are going to do an environmental impact statement. They have to figure out which agencies need to be involved and pull those agencies in and get the right folks in place. They're developing documents that will allow them to hire experts that they might need to analyze some of the issues. It's going to take a while. I mean, it is a real detailed and thorough examination. So, it can last anywhere up to 6 years. And what we want is we want to see it done well. And so however long it takes to do it right is how long we think it should take.
And one victory along the way for us was that they are requiring a full environmental impact statement as part of this process, which we expect will include climate impacts.
Yes, it will include climate impacts. It should include climate impacts. And it's important. They can do, sometimes the Army Corps does these kind of mini, assessments of like, oh, are there any environmental issues? No, not really. That's not what this is. This is like really sitting down and looking at what all the environmental impacts will be, and doing it in a way that we can comment on. And, if they don't do it correctly, then there's always the opportunity to challenge that in federal court.
So this process that we're talking about is all about shutting or preventing the oil tunnel. And then it's separate from the process to shut down the existing Line 5, which also needs to happen. So can you give us an update on where we're at in that process?
So when the governor provided the notice to Enbridge that DNR and the state of Michigan were revoking and terminating the easement, on that same day, the Attorney General filed a lawsuit asking for a declaratory judgment and an injunction ordering Enbridge to shut the line down. Enbridge filed a lawsuit in federal court and asked for that state court case to be removed to the federal court. So Enbridge would very much prefer having these issues heard in federal court because they see that as a friendlier forum for them. The state did not agree that that was appropriate because all of the issues that the state raised were state law issues, and you can't force a plaintiff to move their state law claims to federal court if there's no federal issues. So right now, the judge in the federal court is going to have to decide whether the Attorney General's lawsuit should stay in state court or stay or go to federal court. And so that's the process it's in. It's real frustrating. So I think there's a lot of frustration out there that like this whole thing is just sort of delayed a judge looking at the real merits of the case. And so hopefully there will be a decision sometime soon. I know that the state was involved in mediation because the court ordered it, but it looks like that mediation might be coming to an end.
And meanwhile, Enbridge continues to operate Line 5 in violation of the governor's order.
They do, recognizing too that the governor has made it clear that she considers them to be in trespass and she'll seek damages for that trespass when the court decides that, that revocation and termination of the easement was proper.
That's right. That was a bold move. I thought that was fantastic that she did that.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So for our listeners who want to get more involved in fighting climate change and stopping the tunnel, what would you recommend? How can people get involved?
Well, I think getting involved, there's a lot going on at local levels. There are a lot of communities and cities that are making their own climate resolutions, that are declaring climate emergencies, that are starting to put real resources towards reducing their own carbon emissions and carbon emissions of their residents. So I think you can get involved locally just with your government, make it a priority in your own government. Make it known to decision makers and to officials that you support things like the commitments to reduce carbon, like Governor Whitmer's commitment to reduce carbon, that you support that and that you want to see real action coming from it. With respect to, the case in front of the Public Service Commission now, any individual can submit a comment in any Public Service Commission docket. And there are, great instructions online on how to do that. So you can always have your voice be heard in that way as well.
And at our website, we have just put up an action so people can go there and either get talking points to send in your own comment, or you can just send in a comment right through our website. And then you can also go to ELPC or MyCan and support our work through our websites as well.
Of course. Get Kate's emails. That's how you can do more. She'll tell you what can be done.
And so kind of to wrap it up, what gives you hope? You're working on climate change, you're in the middle of all of this. How do you keep going? What gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of one of the more depressing cases I've worked on in a while, because when I read through all of that evidence, it was like, this is just, it's scary, right? It's just scary what will happen if we don't start to make some smart decisions. What gives me hope is that we have opportunities right now, right? Like this one, very concrete things, smart decisions that can be made, and there's legal authority to make them. It is like, there's no roadblock here to saying it doesn't make sense to invest in more fossil fuel infrastructure. Like it gives me hope that we have these things teed up for decisions, and that if our leadership here in Michigan makes the right decisions, that will have a ripple effect throughout the country. So that's what I try to focus on.
I love that. Beautifully said. So it's such a pleasure to work with you, Margrethe. It's so meaningful, this work, and so exciting. And you're also just really fun to work with. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you.
Same to you. You're one of my favorite clients, Kate.
Oh, wow. And that's good, because you get to work with a lot of great clients.
I have a lot of cool clients, so that's saying something.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining us on the podcast. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you for having me, Kate.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Speaking of Resilience podcast. You can find more episodes of the Speaking of Resilience podcast at our website, groundworkcenter.org/podcast, miclimateaction.org/podcast, or on all major podcast platforms. If you appreciate this content and want more of it, stay up to date by subscribing to the podcast wherever you listen in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps other listeners find the Speaking of Resilient podcast. Like us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Groundwork Center and at MI Climate Action. Speaking of Resilience is created by the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities and the Michigan Climate Action Network. This episode was produced by Taylor Kramer of Cold Shower Media in collaboration with Nick Loud of the Boardman Review.